Ready whenever.
Okay, we're good to go.
Well,
Thank you so much for joining us. We're so
sure.
lucky to have you here, Bradley Tusk. You need no introduction, but I will do it anyway. You're the CEO of Tusk Strategies, venture capitalist, political strategist, writer, former campaign manager for Bloomberg. You also host this fantastic podcast. If you guys haven't listened to it, I loved listening to it, called Firewall. You had a friend of mine, David Litt, on, so I love it.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, funny guy.
Yeah, really funny. It was a fun podcast because he was funny.
Right. And, super insightful. I think super well paced, which is always something you kind of find interesting. So I guess let's just get started where we always seem to, the presidential election.
Sure.
I want to get your larger take on it, but I want to do something a little bit different this time. So how are you looking at this? What are the threats to both candidates? What are the opportunities?
Yeah.
And how much would you be willing to buy the candidate you believe will win for?
Yeah, so I think I'd be willing to buy quite a bit, actually. And at least here's how I'm looking at it, which is referendums are re-elections are referendums on the incumbent, and they're just very, very different than an open seat. And so ultimately, I think this is true whether it's mayor, governor, at least any executive branch job where you actually have a sense of how the person's performing. Legislators could go for years, no one has any clue whatsoever. If things had been really good, so probably 2 years ago, if you asked me how's Trump going to do, I would have said if status quo can continue, if the economy stays this strong, and we are no longer, we're not enmeshed in some sort of ground war, he's going to get reelected. Because I think there's no president ever that has, had a good economy, not been in a war, and not gotten reelected. And the question was, because Trump's such an outlier, could he still manage to possibly change that? Anyway, now the economy is very bad, right? You got 50 million people that filed for unemployment already. You have a crisis that he has mishandled terribly. I think there are unless you believe that the pandemic is a hoax, I think there are very few people who would say he's handled it well. And so the economy is bad. Executives are judging the crisis more than anything else. So if you think about some of the kind of more famous politicians in the US, like Rudy Giuliani's heyday was 9/11, right? When I worked for Mike Bloomberg, it was sort of the big moments, the blackout, the snowstorms, Hurricane Sandy, that really determined how the public felt about him in a lot of ways. Andrew Cuomo has seemed to have risen to the occasion in New York, and has seen his numbers go way up. But if you mishandle a crisis, your career could easily be on the line. And that has happened to the president. So I think that's number two. Number three is enthusiasm, turnout. And I think the combination of Hillary just sort of being a candidate that didn't excite people, combined with, once you're in power for 8 years, you kind of take things for granted. And so just, you didn't have the kind of turnout. But, the Bernie voters who didn't show up for Hillary in Minneapolis or Madison or Detroit, that cost her those states, they're voting for Biden, right? Because they now have lived through 4 years of Trump, and they understand Biden may not be nearly progressive enough for me, but we have to get out of where we are right now. I don't really think that the money is going to end up, the differential is going to be that great. Yeah, Trump has more money right now. But, when you have an election where the incumbent has 100% name ID, right? I'm really not sure there's a single American that hasn't heard of Donald Trump. And Biden's got incredibly high name ID also because he was the vice president for 8 years. I'm not sure how much money really matters. There's not that much persuasion left to do, right? Most people know how they feel one way or another. So if you put all of those factors together, the political pundit or campaign manager in me says that, if the status quo remains for August, September, October, there's a really good chance that Biden wins. And I would put probably a significant amount of money on that. Now, the one variable that just today has been kind of gnawing me a little bit is, and Trump, by the way, for all of his flaws, he's a smart politician, right? Whether or not I think he's smart any other way, and I'm not a big fan, but one thing that really impacts people's votes is the feeling for their own safety, right? Probably their jobs and their safety are probably the two biggest determinatives of how people vote.
Yeah.
And you have this big uptick in crime in cities all over the U.S., especially New York, especially Chicago, separate from what you see in Portland, where it's, violence or unrest related to protest. That's one thing, right? but this is specifically for a bunch of different reasons, and you can debate why, but it feels unsafe all of a sudden. If people feel unsafe, they will often vote for the candidate that makes them feel safer. You know, in 01, when Mike was running for mayor in New York, we don't win without 9/11. You know, we win because 9/11 happens, and all of a sudden the public said, this guy seems really smart and really competent, and will probably do a better job keeping us safe, which he did. So that worries me a bit, that if crime really spirals out of control, people who would right now be inclined to not vote for Trump, or maybe just sit it out entirely, come back out and do vote for him again, like they did in 2016. So that would be the biggest factor in Trump's favor. Or if a vaccine were fully produced and distributed before Election Day, different story. But I don't think anyone's predicting that.
Do you see the campaign, or the Trump campaign? Obviously, we saw him, or federal troops, or federal, not troops, but federal law enforcement agents or whatever, moving into Albuquerque, Chicago, Kansas City, I believe, was the other one. Do you see that sort of leaning into it as trying to underscore this law and order?
Yeah. I mean, I think Trump does everything for electoral gain. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I think that's what motivates all of his decisions. And yeah, I think he understands that, you know, I can't run really on a strong economy right now, because it's not, even though the market continues to sort of hold up and do pretty well. I can't run on having handled a crisis really well. Yeah, we're not at war, but it's just not anyone's, foreign policy sort of not anyone's mind one way or the other. So all you really have left is, I have to scare them into voting for me. And that's when sending in troops to Albuquerque or Chicago or Kansas City, whatever it is, says, hey, I'm in charge and Biden's too weak to handle this and I'm not. So, you know, I think it's not a dumb political play. I think it's a little scary to use federal troops to make a political point, but that's separate.
So one of the purposes of these podcasts, or these, I guess we call podcasts, but virtual happy hours, is to bring, you know, great minds like yourself to our traders and help them understand the metrics by which people sort of measure within a political campaign, or, you know. And so when you're looking at this larger campaign, what are the metrics you're looking for? What are those sort of, you know, you talk about the economy, you talk about all those different things, but are there numbers that you're looking at?
Yeah, so there are a couple of numbers that in a re-election, to me, are pretty meaningful. And yes, this is a presidential, but I'm not really sure my answer will be that different if you ask me about a gubernatorial or a mayoral race, which is the re-elect number. So it's not so much who are you for, or what's your opinion of the incumbent, approve, disapprove, fave, unfave, but do you think the president in this case should be re-elected? That's a really critical metric. And we've seen them kind of all over the board, from mid-30s to mid-40s, basically, depending on the poll that you're looking at. Because if you have a situation where everyone knows who the incumbent is, and again, everybody knows who Donald Trump is, right? Mm-hmm. And you've had him in your life for 4 years, and he hasn't just been in our life for 4 years, he's kind of consumed our lives for 4 years, for better or for worse. Your opinion's pretty much set, and your mind's made up. And something incredibly big and surprising would have to happen at this point to change it. And so wherever that number is pretty much, I think, where you end up in the popular vote at the end of the day. So in my mind, that is the most important metric by a lot. So that's number one. Number two would be, in the horse race, what's the undecided number, right? Because I think one of the challenges for Trump is, it's not just that he's down, and it was at 9-10% overall, and as much as 15 in that Washington Post ABC News poll the other day, but there's almost no undecided, right? We're at 5%, 7%, 9%. That's a very tiny amount. Because he is so divisive, and because Biden in some ways is so anodyne and vanilla and just hanging out in the rec room in the basement, it's going to be very hard to change anyone's minds. So if all of a sudden the amount that you're behind by is greater than the undecided gap, that's really a problem. So to me, if I were looking at, you know, putting money on the outcome, those are probably the two things I would look at most.
What do you think? Because the enthusiasm I found kind of interesting. There's enthusiasm, you know, that seems to be really great for Trump, and then also the enthusiasm against him is really great. Where do you fall on that enthusiasm gap?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, you know, he needs to have, the people who like him really like him, right? There's no question about that. And post-presidency, he will probably continue to have a very big fan base,
Mhm.
but it's still not any more than 37% of the country or something like that, right? And what he was able to do in 16 was combine that with the intense dislike for Hillary and just some sort of blasé feelings by voters, kind of anger and petulance by the Sanders supporters, and all that combined to these tiny little margins in these different states that led to his victory. I don't think any of those other factors exist right now. So he may have the same 35 to 40% of people who really like him,
Mhm.
but the other 10 to 15% that you need, it just sort of isn't there. And in some ways, because Biden's just, he's fine, right? I don't know anyone that like loves Joe Biden, but I don't know any people that hate him either. He's just, but that in some ways is the perfect place to be, which is like, no one really has strong feelings either way.
And to that point, you say 10 to 15%. We have Brian Lanza, who is former deputy comms for the 2016 campaign and Trump 2016, and he was talking about white suburban female voters or white college educated female voters that tend to be that crux.
Yeah.
When you're looking at that segment of the population, does this law and order approach work for them?
It can, right? It can. However, if you're talking about that specific segment of the population, schools are probably not going to be fully reopened in the fall, right? Like my kid's school, my daughter's going to ninth grade, looking at 1 day a week in person, 4 days remote. My son's going into sixth grade, half days, 4 days a week in person. No parent that I know of who's dealing with remote learning is particularly happy about it, right? And while Trump didn't create COVID-19, he also hasn't handled it particularly well. And so if your existence every day is somehow trying to scramble between getting your work done and keeping your kids on track and keeping the house from burning down, I think that dominates your thinking more than anything else. And that frustration all really cuts against Trump. Now, look, if in suburbs all of a sudden, like if you, not that Trump could ever win New York, but like on Long Island, there's a big gang called MS-13 that is a suburban gang, right? Trump's actually made a big deal about them over the last couple of years. If you saw a lot of violence in suburban communities, that would probably have an impact. But the odds of that really blowing up in the next 3 months probably aren't that high.
Yeah. As the time gets tighter, the variables seem to get a little bit less wild.
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast. You were talking about the job of the New York mayor, I think, and sort of how hard that is and how it's about trash and the minutia of running a city, not necessarily about ideology. And this is just a theoretical question, so sorry that I want us to like nail down on numbers, but how much of governing is that ideology at the national level, and how much is it the managing crises, like you said?
Yeah, it's right. So in most of the time, being president is not nearly as operational as being mayor or being governor. And basically, each job, it's inverse proportion. So mayor is the most operational, then governor, then president, with legislators like nobody even pretends that they run anything, right? But in a time of massive crisis, that changes, and we are in a time of massive crisis right now. And I think people may not care that much about your management abilities as president, but they kind of want to think that you're competent and you know what's going on and you have a grasp on the whole thing. I mean, I spent about a month with Mike Bloomberg this past February when he was running for president, just kind of traveling around with him and trying to help out wherever I could. And there are a lot of things that the campaign did wrong, but one of the things that always struck me was Mike was constantly thinking about the job as a management responsibility. He would talk about, okay, I'm going to have 2 million employees if I win this thing, or I have a postal service of this size, or military of this. What will be my strategies to manage them to maximum effectiveness and efficiency? Yeah. I've never heard anyone talk about the presidency like that before. And Mike is just a unique person, you know, and had been mayor for 12 years. So that's how his mind works. So I don't think Trump is held as accountable as, say, Bill de Blasio is right now for just sort of the poor quality of life that we have in New York City. And I'm in New York, so my answers tend to be skewed towards New York. But when the economy is bad and when you're in a crisis and it's not going well, people care.
Yeah, and so it becomes more, you know, a referendum on, are you managing this well? Do you think that's part of why we're starting to see these coronavirus briefings pop up again?
Yeah, sure. He's got to demonstrate that he's in charge. And look, Woody Allen's, I don't know if you're allowed to quote Woody Allen anymore, but he has a great quote saying 90% of life is showing up. That's kind of right. So like, look at Andrew Cuomo.
Yeah.
Did he do a great job? I don't know. I mean, he delayed a lot in the first 2 weeks, and I think that might have cost a lot of lives. The way he handled the whole nursing home situation was probably pretty bad. But he was there every day, looked on top of it, exuding a sense of sort of calm and confidence. And that makes people feel better and they feel like someone's in charge. And it goes an incredibly long way. Now, look, there's a reason why Trump stopped doing the briefings, which is he wasn't disciplined enough to handle them in a way like Cuomo was, where he could just dispassionately give information and come off empathetic and seem like he's really on top of things. If you're just randomly wandering from topic to topic that have nothing to do with COVID, that's bad. But turns out the alternative, which is just looking completely removed from the crisis, is even worse.
It's probably worth note, I guess, watching whether or not he can stay on script as these briefings continue.
It doesn't seem like he's capable of that. Now, sometimes that really works to his advantage, right? I think in 2016, he was this really unscripted candidate, and you had people like Rubio and Bush that were incredibly scripted and formulaic.
Yeah.
And their primary voters love that, right? And enough general election voters liked it to elect him. But again, in a campaign, you have no real responsibility other than trying to appeal to voters. You run the country with a lot of responsibility. When you're running the country during a global pandemic, you really have a lot of responsibility. And if you can't seem up to it, you're really going to be penalized for that.
Yeah. So we'll shift gears a little bit. This has been fun so far. Very informative. Let's chat about the Electoral College. So what states are you looking at you think you might be able to grab some value in? So we've got Texas, Georgia, Iowa, Florida seem to be some of those. Where are you really looking?
Yeah, so look, Texas is like the great white whale for Democrats. It is fascinating when you look at the demographics and you see the number of Latinos that keep moving into the state, and you see people like a Beto O'Rourke or the Castro brothers do really well. You start to think, well, maybe this is possible. I still think it's unlikely. My guess is more likely that what happens is, and I'm not sure that the traders really care about state legislative politics, but for example, like you guys, I'm in the gaming business as well and have some interest in casinos, and I'm really interested in whether or not casino gambling can come to Texas. Mm-hmm. Texas is now projecting a $4.6 billion budget deficit for next year. Most states, when they have big deficits, turn to gambling, right? Because while it may not be wildly popular, it is less unpopular than raising taxes or cutting services. Yeah. And so the question for Texas is, okay, would they do that? Normally the answer is no, because it's a very conservative state. But let's say Biden loses 52-48 in Texas, you could see a huge shift in the state Senate and the state House, where not that they flip the Democrats, but the numbers get so much closer that all of a sudden things that normally seem impossible in a state that seems so governed by kind of evangelical religious principles, all of a sudden changes. So I think there will be enough change in Texas this year that the governance of the state will be impacted potentially significantly. If I still had to put money on it today, I still say Biden. I mean, I still say Trump, but could things continue to get worse and worse for the president where it ultimately does flip? Yeah, except the question, if you're the Biden campaign, are you ever going to spend a lot of money in Texas? Probably not, right? You don't need Texas to win. It's still a big leap of faith. You're still better off trying in Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina. So it's the most exciting one on the map for sure. But I think you got to be careful about not kind of falling for too much enthusiasm.
What is the price that's too high in Arizona for you, for Democrats or Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're getting there right now, right? I mean, you have just this massive crisis. They don't have testing. They don't seem to have really any control over what's happening right now. And if the wave just keeps cresting and cresting and debts keep going up and up, and of course, as that happens, the economy sort of, it's exactly related to it proportionally. So then everything shuts down, especially if you're in a shelter in place. That's the moment in Arizona where all of a sudden people start to say, okay, I've had it, I'm changing. I don't remember off the top of my head whether or not Arizona has early voting, But I think also,
States do to a certain
yeah,
degree.
if assuming that they do, and assuming that mail is going to be a more significantly available option for voters, if people are at home, I think you're just going to see a lot of ballots returned early, submitted early, and if they're watching TV and everything feels bad, every instinct you have is to vote for change.
Yeah. Do you think the strategy to sort of defer to governors when you have a Republican governor and maybe things don't go well could backfire to Trump, or do you think vice versa? Do you think that the people in these states are assigning blame based on party if things aren't going well?
I think people are capable of blaming more than one politician at a time. I suspect that the White House theory was, we'll defer to the governors. If they get it right, Trump will take credit for anything anyway. So what? And if they get it wrong, the governors will have to sort of, bear the brunt of it, not the president. The problem is, in a situation this big and this global, it's really hard for a federalist system to really work, right? And so, like Governor Ducey, who, by the way, I think in some ways in Arizona is a really interesting governor in terms of my work as venture capitalist. I really love his attitude towards technology and innovation. But when you're a libertarian, you have very clear views around the role of government, and it's a very, very limited role, which may oftentimes make sense, right? I spent 4 years as the deputy governor of Illinois, and often thought that we had too much government and too much activity and too much money. So I'm not sure that he's wrong on a macro level, but in a pandemic like this, you kind of need a pretty activist government. And so I do think that governors will take the hit, but I don't think it's going to shield Trump from any liability at all.
So as the race, as it goes along with the presidential, do you think it tightens? Do you think that conventional wisdom exists that it will ultimately tighten? I was talking to a pollster friend of mine the other day, and he was like, I don't know if this is really something that we should look for, because it seems pretty consistent as it is right now.
Yeah, again, it could tighten if a vaccine either happens or is there very clearly on the way. It could tighten if, I don't know, all of a sudden the closing the Chinese consulate in Houston leads to some sort of military, issue. It could tighten. If crime starts spiraling out of control in the suburbs, it could tighten. Assuming those things don't happen, and you look at the underlying metrics, it's hard to really see why it would, because there are these like normative cascades almost, where like you're walking to a restaurant and you see no one's in there, and you're like, yeah, I'm not going to go there, right? Now, it may be a great place where you would have gotten amazing service because no one else is there, but the emptiness scares you off. Or I don't know if you're a sports fan, but like in the draft, sometimes they think that someone's going to go really high, and they'll get picked third or fifth or seventh, and then everyone's like, something's wrong with him, and then he just plummets. Like Aaron Rodgers, one of the best quarterbacks of all time, won 24th his year. So normative cascades happen in politics too, and I think we're in one right now where every single succeeding thing that happens builds upon the previous one, and they're all worse and worse and worse for the incumbent. And I think as a result of that, absent some sort of black swan event, it's hard to really see why the race would materially tighten.
It is 2020. We've had a couple of black swans, haven't we?
Yeah. That's a fair point.
Let's not throw that in there. I don't know how much more I can take this year. So when you look at key down ballot races, what are you looking at as sort of a bellwether race? Let's look at North Carolina. Maybe.
Yeah. So I don't think my answer is going to be different than anyone else. It's North Carolina, it's Arizona, it's Iowa, it's Maine. Sorry,
real quick. We would go to the Senate races, Amy. Sorry, she's just rolling up.
Okay.
Yeah, we pull these up on screen. So very, very high-end production we have going.
Yeah. But yeah, the challenge for the McConnell and the GOP is all of the states where it looks like the Democrat could potentially challenge. Alaska is actually another one.
Yeah.
Are generally states that are all of a sudden in play, other than Alaska, which is going to be Republican in the presidential no matter what. But and so it's going to be really, really tough to defend that many seats.
Yeah.
And if you have this just massive sweep for Biden, it's hard to see how Schumer doesn't end up as majority leader, and the Democrats don't take back the Senate. Now, Chuck has to be careful what he wishes for, because he could have be majority leader, not get anything done. They get taken out by AOC in 2022 in a primary. So we'll see if that ends up being good or bad for him. But if I had to bet right now, I would bet on the Democrats taking the Senate back. And when Democrats ask me how they could make the greatest use of their contributions, my answer is always Senate. And look, I'm an independent. I think both parties are wildly corrupt, so I have no affinity for either one of them. But if you are a Democrat and you really want to have the greatest impact, you would help the Senate candidates.
A couple questions. When you're looking at like Iowa, for instance, which an Iowa Senate race is super close in our market right now, where are you buying on that?
It is hard to see what Ernst has done that would really earn her reelection. It just feels like in any race that is really close, if all of the momentum is shifting towards the presidential candidate on the Democratic side, then it just kind of flows with it on the Senate side too. So anything that's within the margin of error right now, if you said I want to bet it today, I'd bet the Democrat.
Okay, and then we'll go down a couple more. North Carolina, where you put your money?
Cunningham seems reasonably competent, so same thing. I mean, so I would say Arizona, Maine, Iowa, North Carolina, all four of those, if I had to put money on it today, I'd put it on the Democratic candidate.
On any of those, is there a price too high for the Democratic candidate?
That's a relative question, right? Because the price is only too high if you don't have the resources, right? Because it's not like any of them have to take some sort of pledge to support the Communist Party or the Socialists or whatever else. They're all moderate Democrats who are going to try to survive, in Washington. And so it's just a question of dollars, right? And I think one good thing the Senate Democrats have going for them is Chuck Schumer, and I worked for Chuck for a couple of years in the Senate, is just an incredible fundraiser. And as a result, they'll probably have the money.
You mentioned AOC primarying Schumer. Do you really think that's going to happen? And do you think that's a smart move?
I mean, part of me just wants to see it happen because it'd be so fun, right? Like what a heavyweight battle. It'd be amazing.
It'd be a battle for the future of the Democratic Party, wouldn't it?
Yeah, totally. So I'd love to watch it just because it would be so much fun. She is unbelievably ambitious. Yeah. She seems to be afraid of nothing. I don't agree with her on most issues, but it's hard. You can't have any appreciation for politics and not think that she is just an exceptionally talented person. Right? She just is, whether you like her or not. And a lot of it's going to depend on how Chuck does in those 2 years as majority leader. Right? If something really big happens, if some version of Obamacare, if the ACA happens in 2021, that's probably enough for Chuck to hold on to his seat. But let's say that through filibusters and whatever else, nothing really big gets done, and it's all kind of small incremental stuff, or even worse, Pelosi's sending him bills and he can't move them through, then I think he's really, really vulnerable. And in some ways, because Chuck is the most media-hungry member of Congress, at least he's the most media-hungry politician in Washington, but Trump now eclipses him on that, but he's still the most media-hungry member of Congress. You can't put yourself in the public spotlight and eye all day, every day, and then not expect people to notice when all of a sudden you're in charge and you're held accountable for the outcomes. So I would bet that Chuck will actually be pretty successful as majority leader, and as a result will win re-election. But if you told me that AOC beats him in a primary in 2 years, would I be shocked? No.
With that, how do Schumer and Biden work together if Biden were to win? Do they work together well?
Yeah, I think fine. I think the relationship was always somewhere between fine and pretty good that I'm aware of in the Senate. Mm-hmm. And I think that, Biden knows the Senate, loves the Senate, is of the Senate. And I think one place where Chuck will get a lot of help is Biden, unlike Trump and unlike Obama, I think will be willing to spend a lot of time with Republican senators to try to kind of pull them over on specific votes and specific issues. So Chuck won't have to do it all by himself. And so I think in some ways, if you were Chuck and you needed a president who understood your job and actually just genuinely wanted to be involved and help, that can happen. Now, could there be times where Chuck feels like Biden's stepping on his toes a little bit? Sure, you could see how that happens. But all in all, I think it's pretty well set up for him.
Do you see a world in which Biden loses and Democrats take the Senate?
No. I see a world where Biden wins and Democrats don't take the Senate. That would require one of those black swan events or just things really tightening up. But the opposite seems, and look, after 2016, I guess anything is possible.
Yeah.
But hey, Allison, my computer's about to die, so I get a charger. I'm really sorry. I'm going to be right back. Right?
No, grab it. I'd rather have you on. So we'll look at some of the questions you guys have put in. We'll hopefully be able to grab some of those in a second. So thanks for your patience. Really appreciate that. Just wait.
You can watch me try to install a charger.
It's great. It's what everybody wants to do when they're being recorded, right? So we'll move on to some of the questions that these guys have, but I have a couple more myself. You've had this crazy political career and the behind the scenes of so many different ridiculous, I'm sure, experiences. What was the most Veep-like experience in your political career?
I mean, so a lot of them, right? Because
Most of them.
Most of them. Because the reason why Veep was such an amazing show is it was only like 12% too ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
And that's why these people like you or me love it so much, because it's like, yeah, they're basically getting it right, and then they're messing around to make it really funny. Yeah. And by the way, a lot of times working in government was really funny. But look, I spent 4 years, as I mentioned, as the deputy governor of Illinois, worked for a guy named Roger Golovich. So you can't really get more absurd than that, right? And so, like for example, and I wrote about this in my book. There was a Homeland Security, like a tabletop exercise. So basically what happened is, I think at the time it was Tom Ridge, who was the Homeland Security Secretary, and governors would get on the phone, they would pretend there's some sort of major crisis, and they would kind of game play how they would handle it, right? Rod's father-in-law was a guy named Dick Mel. Dick Mel was a ward boss in Chicago. And Mel felt like he had made Rod's career, and Rod, not shockingly, rebelled against that and felt like Mel was taking credit for things that Rod had done. So they kind of hated each other.
Yeah.
The same morning as the tabletop exercise, Rod gets this letter that Mel sent out as a fundraiser for himself because he's running for re-election to the Chicago City Council. And it's saying Rod is the keynote speaker. But I guess Rod had never agreed or even been asked to be the keynote speaker. And he is going ballistic, calling everyone he knows who might give money to Mel, tell them if they do, they're dead to him. So, and by the way, this is all happening at his house because Rod refused to ever come to the office. So we're at his house. He's yelling and screaming. And I went over there because at this point, I've been working for a few months. And I'm like, he may not get in this call if I don't go over there. So I'm going to have to drive to his house in Northwest Chicago and kind of sit next to him and make him get on the phone. And it's like the call was at 10:30 and it's like 10:22. I'm like, Rod, we got to do this call. Yeah, in a minute. 10:24, 10:27. I'm like, oh my God, what do we do here? And 10:30 hits, and I said, I tried to hand him the phone, and he just said, no. I said, you have to. And he said, no. I said, fuck. So I just got on the phone, and they didn't really have like a roll call for the attendance. But at some point, Rich is talking, and he says, Governor Blagojevich, do you consent to send the National Guard? And in my best Rod voice, I said, yes, I do. And I hope that no one realized. You know, I almost was like when you're a kid trying to sound like an adult. That's almost like what I think my voice probably sounded like. And I, for better, authorized the National Guard to come out because he was too busy yelling and screaming about his ward boss father-in-law.
It's a very Chicago story.
Yeah, if ever Chicago was like, yeah, of course that happened. Right?
Of course it happened. So We're going to go ahead. Who do you think is the best VP selection for Biden if he wants to make sure he wins the election?
So I think it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I would pick an African-American woman only because we're in a moment where it makes sense. And I think if you don't, there's explaining you have to do that just seems unnecessary. However, if you look at it, there's no evidence of any VP selection since Johnson in 1960 that has had any material impact on the outcome at all. And the reason why Johnson mattered is they stole Texas. I mean, they literally just like miscounted the votes and hoarded ballot boxes, stuff like that. So the Kennedy took the state, and Daley did the same thing in Chicago, and that's how Kennedy became the president. So absent fraud and theft, which is what happened in 1960, the VP just doesn't really matter. People like us love to obsess about it. We spend all this time thinking about it. But look, whether it's Keisha Lance Bottoms or Kamala Harris or Val Demings, or even if it's, Tammy Duckworth, it doesn't matter. It's not going to impact any votes. It doesn't ever really win you a swing state. So the real question is just this person will likely be the Democratic nominee, or at least has a good shot of being it in 24. And Biden's really old, right? So it's not clear that he'll finish his term.
Yeah.
Canceled. Can I get Lyle to watch what I want now?
I'll be there in a second. You guys got to work it out. My kids are fighting over who's in charge of the TV. My daughter's pushing to watch the Hamilton movie, and my son is pushing to watch anything but that.
It's tomorrow, so.
Yeah, you guys got to work out.
We'll lock this up pretty quickly.
No, we're done. I don't want to watch Hamilton either, actually. I saw it play. It was great. I'm good. The thing with the VP is this person could be president in the next 4 years if the president doesn't serve the whole term, and has a really good shot of being the nominee, in 2024. So it's got to be someone really competent. So for me personally, I've worked in city government, state government, federal government, executive branch, legislative branch, campaigns, kind of the whole gamut. I really think that you want someone out of the executive branch, especially because Biden was a career legislator. And to me, mayors are the people who get the most done. Yeah. So to me, Mayor Bottoms of Atlanta, Mayor Bowser in DC, like those would be the kind of people that I think I would pick.
Interesting. Do you think people are lying to pollsters?
I think people do lie to pollsters. There's this famous thing, the Tom Bradley effect. For the people listening or watching who don't know what that is, Tom Bradley was the mayor of Los Angeles, ran for governor of California. I guess it was like late 80s, I think. And in the polling, he was way up. He was African American, and then he lost the election. And there was a lot of trying to figure out what happened. How did this happen? And the conclusion was people didn't want to tell the pollster that they didn't want to vote for the African American candidate because they didn't want to seem racist to the pollster. But then when they were in the secrecy of the ballot box, they didn't vote for the African American candidate. So, weirdly, when some random person calls you on the phone, you still, on some level, care what they think of you, and say things based on how you think they're going to impact. By the way, these people are a call center who don't give a shit about what you just think on anything, right? So,
probably 70 people that day.
Right. So, it doesn't matter in the slightest. But yeah, people do lie to pollsters. And that obviously helped Trump. But, and then there's been a lot written about this, I feel like, in the past couple of days. It helped Trump to the tune of a couple of points, right? So if on election eve, Biden's up by 3, yeah, I would be worried if I were Biden. But if you're up by 12, maybe your margin will be a little less than you thought. But people don't lie to pollsters that much.
You have done some work on mobile voting.
Yeah.
Do you think that the way that people have been talking about mail-in voting is setting that back? How do you feel about your thought 2024, for instance?
Yeah, it's helpful. So if I could take 1 minute to explain why. So I spend a huge amount of my time and money on this. It's the main thing we do out of my foundation. Having spent all this time in politics, the main takeaway I had from all of it is every policy output is determined by a political issue. And if you want different laws passed, different policies, different regulations, you have to give politicians the right incentives to do so. They will always make the rational, logical choice that heightens their chance of re-election and nothing else. And because for them, holding office is like water or oxygen for you or me, right? That validation, it fills this hole in their psyche that makes them desperately self-loathing and unhappy otherwise. And so giving it up just to do the right thing is never, ever going to happen for these guys. So if you want different outputs, you need different inputs. So if you take, for example, I'll go back to New York again. A year ago, Amazon wanted to build a headquarters in Queens. 25,000 direct jobs, another 50,000 indirect jobs. A handful of politicians from AOC to others opposed the deal. And people kind of thought they must be crazy because look at the polling. 70% of New Yorkers support this. People want this. 63% of Democrats support this. Why would you be against it? But they're very smart. And they said, you know what? That may be true, but turnout in my primary last time was 18,000 votes in a state Senate seat in a state of 20 million people, right? And of those 18,000 people, the majority of them really, really, really hate Amazon. And so what happened was a few weeks ago, we had primaries in New York, and all these candidates who opposed Amazon were on the ballot. And there was some talk around, well, now we've got 1 million people unemployed in New York City because of COVID. They're really going to pay the price. They all got reelected with at least 75% of the vote. And turnout on average was about 8 or 9% in each state. So the point is, they behaved rationally and logically in order to get reelected in their next election, right? But let's say turnout in that same primary was 40% or 60%. Then whatever the prevailing public sentiment is would be what you would be for because you want to keep your seat. So whether it's assault weapons or abortion or charter schools or whatever else on the left or the right, when only the most ideologically motivated voters show up in primaries, and when turnout is so small, then any special interest money can really impact the outcome potentially. The logical thing to do is to do what those voters want and what those interests want. And if we ever want to see a Congress or a state government for that matter that can get consensus on climate change, healthcare, education, guns, immigration, go down the list, you're going to have to radically change the inputs or you're not going to get different outputs. If we don't get different outputs, we can't solve all of these problems. And then, our future as a country is really in doubt.
And the inputs would be the votes. So being able to have access to mobile voting, for instance.
It's all about turnout, right? So when after I kind of left politics directly, the next thing I did was I ran all these campaigns to legalize Uber and ride sharing. The thing that we got right, because at the time, we were this tiny little startup and taxi was this cartel with lobbyists and tons of campaign contributions and money. But our bet was our customers would be willing to advocate for us politically if they could do so from the app. And we created the tools where we're able to explain the problem to them on the app and then connect them to their city council member, their state rep, their state senator, whoever was relevant in that particular fight. And as a result, ultimately, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people ended up weighing in on these different issues. And the only good thing about having turnout of 18,000 in a state senate primary is when you're that state senator and 23,000 people reach out to your district office to say, I want this, then you're like, okay, no problem. I'm not going to get in the way of this. And we won in every single jurisdiction in the US. Ride sharing is legal in every market in the country. So I think that it's not whether people care or don't care, it's whether it's convenient or inconvenient. And if they vote on their phones, especially if, let's say they had a month to do it, and turnout would increase exponentially. And I think that would make all the difference. So out of Tusk Philanthropies, we've now funded elections in a dozen different jurisdictions where mobile voting has been held. So far, it's either been for deployed military or people with disabilities, because my thought was who could object to making it easier for those particular groups to vote. So far, so good. We have had no issues of hacking or anything else. Every election has been independently audited by the National Cybersecurity Center. They've all come back clean. Turnout on average has doubled. So it works. The question now is, how do we keep building better and better technology so we can go from having a couple of thousand votes cast in an election online to a couple of million? And so whether it's 2024 or even 2028, scaling up the technology is what we're really focused on right now.
Do you have concern that the conversation about mail-in ballots is going to impact where this can go in the next 10, 20 years?
No, I don't think so. I think it sort of marginally helps us because I think that the minute people get used to the convenience of something, they're not willing to go back to the way it used to be. That's all we want with ride sharing. It's easier to get a car by pressing a button than going outside and hoping someone drives by who happens to be available.
I was late a lot to work because of cabs. So
right.
we were made that a lot easier.
Yeah, exactly. So it is certainly easier to vote on your phone than in a mail-in ballot, but it's
Yeah.
easier to vote in mail than it is on a random Tuesday to figure out, you're going to drop off your kid's school or work or whatever else it is and find parking or walk in the rain, or it's always raining in New York on election day. And so I think the easier you make it, the more people expect that, and they're just going to want to have it as convenient as possible. So I see mail-in voting as very similar to what we're doing.
Two more questions because I know we're taking up a lot of your time.
Not a problem.
I have a friend who has a theory that this argument about mail-in voting is actually going to backfire on Republicans because people who have historically been comfortable with mail-in voting and have cast their ballot that way may end up not voting that way, going to the polls, standing in line, getting annoyed, and then going away. Do you see that sort of backlash at all?
No, I just think that there's two problems in the Trump kind of broadside against mail-in voting. One is it just feels so nakedly personal and political and design, like everything that comes out of Trump's mouth about himself, that it's hard for a lot of people, unless you're already kind of drinking the Kool-Aid, to really take it seriously. But number two is convenience always wins. Always, always, always. I'm a venture capitalist. I invest in new technologies all the time, and I bet on convenience all the time, and my returns are really good. And so ultimately, if you give people two options, they're going to pick the more convenient option. And I think to expect otherwise is just to defy human nature. It's like expecting a politician to take a vote that will cost them their seat just because it's the right thing to do. So I'm not sure if I agree with your friend's theory, but I do think that the Republican opposition to mail-in voting is not going to really limit enthusiasm or turnout for that at all.
Okay. Last question. We've had, throughout the time we've done this, we've had some folks, write in and say, ask Bradley about this, ask James Carville. If I want to get involved in political strategy, I listened to your story about Ed Rendell.
Yeah.
How you got involved in politics. What's your advice to anybody who wants to get involved?
Yeah. Well, so can I tell the story?
Yeah. We'd love to hear a story.
So the summer of I'm dating myself and showing how old I am now, but in the summer of 1992, I guess I was 17, 18, something like that. I had just 18, because I just finished my freshman year of college. And I was working, do you remember the movie, you're too young, the Flamingo Kid? It was Matt Dillon, right? So I had that job in real life. I was the cabana boy at the Sands Beach Club in the summers, getting people iced coffees and, making sure people on the poker game had drinks and all kind of ice and whatever else. And, working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. And it's great in the sense that it's all cash, it's all tips, and you really learn how to hustle. But I get a call one day from a guy named Brian O'Dwyer, and I'm a first generation American. My dad was a refugee, so we didn't know anybody growing up. But my dad just had this guy who randomly was a friend who was a lawyer, and Brian was a lawyer for the Carpenters Union of New York City. And Brian's a really nice guy, and he knew that I was interested in politics, and he knew that I didn't know anybody or anything. And he said, hey, I can get you a one-day Carpenter's pass to the convention. Would you like to go? And I'm like, great. So I figured I'd take a day off from the beach club. And if you look in the newspaper, it says convention noon to midnight. Now, I know that in reality, it's 8 p.m. to 11 p.m., right? But I was this sort of super naive kid, so I don't know. So I show up at Madison Square Garden at noon, and nobody's there, right? It's like two guys from Montana running for state rep speaking. The audience is totally empty. But a guy named Ed Rendell, who at the time was the mayor of Philadelphia, was sitting in the stands by himself. I've asked him a bunch of times ever since, like, why do you think you were sitting there by yourself? And he never really knows the answer. But Rendell is a really, really gregarious guy. And so, if there's no one to talk to, he's just talking to the empty chair next to him. And I figured, you know what? He's the mayor of Philly. I go to school in Philly. He's a Jewish guy from New York. So am I. I'll say hello. What's the worst that could happen? Of course, we have a fun conversation because he'd rather have someone to talk to than not. And of course, I'm this fawning 18-year-old. So what's not to like about it? When the conversation's ending, he said to me, are you busy when you go back to school? And I'm like, no, not really. He's like, do you want an internship? I said, that'd be great. I said, okay, send me a note. We'll set it up. So I go home, I write a letter. Every day I'm opening the mailbox and there's no reply from the mayor. And what I didn't know then, but I know now, is that correspondence is a black hole of government, right? Everything goes in, nothing comes out. And so I get back to school and I don't know why I thought this. One day I'm just, you know what? I still really like to do that. I'll go see him. So I got on the subway and went to City Hall. And this is a decade before 9/11. So security then wasn't what it is today.
Yeah.
I got to like, not the person that like, he says, hey, can you get me a cup of coffee or whatever it is, kind of the outer office, which is still pretty far to get.
Yeah.
I said, is the mayor here? And we think about, that's a crazy question to ask, right? But I was sort of this young, naive kid, and they kind of realized, nice old ladies from South Philly, like blue hair,
Yeah.
and they realized that, and they said, he's a little busy. I said, okay, would you like to leave a note? I said, sure. So I write a note. I get back on the subway, and it hits me halfway in the subway. I'm like, you idiot, you can't just like go see the mayor. So I'm like, all right, this is never gonna happen.
Yeah.
I get back to the dorm, phone rings, hold for the mayor. He said, when are you coming to work? I said, I'll be there in 20 minutes. And I worked for him all through college, and that's how I got started in politics. And so the great thing about politics is the gating point is not that high, right? People will accept you as a volunteer for their campaign. I was an unpaid intern, right? They'll accept an unpaid internship. You can, through hustle and discipline and force of will, work your way into politics. And the thing that I always find on campaigns is, sometimes it's the person who is like a volunteer or super low-level staffer, and they're smart enough to stay every night at the campaign office till 9, 10 o'clock, because that's when the people who run the campaign finally get a break to start figuring out the strategy for the next day, the next week, whatever it is. And if you see the same kid sitting there for like 3 weeks in a row, you're like, all right, you can come sit with us while we talk about this and listen in. And then all of a sudden, they become part of the inner circle. And so politics is not like having to be a doctor or an engineer or something where you have to have a lot of education or a lot of training. You can really just have a lot of hustle and a lot of hard work and kind of work your way into it. And so that's one of the things that I kind of love about politics. And it's definitely how I got started.
I also think it's really interesting. A lot of people think, you have to follow this formality, but I love that you just showed up and you were like, hey, where's the mayor?
I literally didn't know better. I'm not sure I would do that now, but look, sometimes being naive is really helpful. So I mentioned when I worked in Illinois, I was 29 when I was the deputy governor of Illinois. I oversaw the state's budget operations, legislation, policy, and communication. So every single major function of state government. I had no business being in that job. Rod never should have hired me for that. I was way too young, way too experienced. But one of the things that we got right, and it was only because I was so young that I didn't know better, was we kind of went for a lot of things legislatively and substantively that a more mature me would be like, no, you're never going to get that. That's never going to happen. Don't even try. And because I didn't know better, we tried, and sometimes we got it, right? So all of a sudden, we're getting universal health care for kids, or universal preschool, or raising the minimum wage, or creating open road tolling on the tollway system, or whatever it is, partly out of naivete. So sometimes not realizing what you can achieve goes really far.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I love that story. And thank you so much for your time, guys. Thanks for your questions. And we will post this, and the rest of our team, and hopefully we'll have you at some point. We won't take up as much of your time.
Right now, it was really fun. Happy to do it.
Take care. Thank you so much.
See you guys. Bye-bye.